66 million years ago, an object more than 10 kilometers in diameter tore through Earth's atmosphere at a speed of approximately 20 kilometers per second and struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The energy released was equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. Within hours, the planet had become unrecognizable. What followed was not simply an extinction. It was the collapse of a biological order that had dominated Earth for 180 million years. Non-avian dinosaurs vanished, pterosaurs fell, marine reptiles sank into seas that had become acidic cauldrons. Between 60 and 80% of all known species went extinct. The Earth fell silent. But something survived in the darkness. Something small, swift, warm-blooded, feeding on seeds and dead insects, raising its young with milk and protecting them underground. Mammals. Animals that had spent more than 100 million years living in the shadow of the great reptiles, confined to the nocturnal margins of the Mesozoic world. When the sky cleared and the light returned, they were still there, and the planet was theirs. This is the story of how that transformation happened, how within the span of barely a million years, creatures the size of a rat began to become whales, elephants, lions, and primates. How life not only survived the greatest cataclysm of the Cenozoic, but used it to rewrite the rules of evolution. This is the story of the Age of Mammals. The day the sun disappeared, the impact and its immediate consequences. The sky burned first. The material ejected by the impact, vaporized rock, incandescent ash, fragments of pulverized crust, rose into the stratosphere and fell over entire continents like a rain of fire. Wildfires spread across North America, Europe, and Asia within days. There was no ecosystem humid enough, no refuge remote enough to escape the embers descending from the sky. Then the darkness came. Particles of soot, sulfates, and mineral dust formed a layer that surrounded the planet and blocked sunlight almost completely. The most widely accepted scientific estimates indicate that global temperatures dropped by up to 20 degrees Celsius within weeks. A fall like that, sustained for years, amounts to a permanent winter, a winter without spring. Photosynthesis stopped immediately. Plants, deprived of light, died en masse. Without plants, herbivores began to starve. Without herbivores, the great predators followed. Food chains that had taken tens of millions of years to form collapsed in the time it takes an ecosystem to consume its reserves. Months. In some cases, weeks. The rain, when it came, was not rain. It was acidic. The energy of the impact had cooked atmospheric nitrogen and the sulfur dioxide released from the limestone rocks of Yucatan to produce nitric and sulfuric acid. That rain burned the remaining foliage and poisoned rivers and lakes. Freshwater ecosystems collapsed from within. The oceans were no exception. The shockwave from the impact had superheated vast areas of the Gulf of Mexico, killing marine organisms by the millions within minutes. Tsunamis swept the coasts. Coral reefs, which had taken millions of years to build, bleached and shattered. Plankton populations, the base of the entire marine food chain, collapsed. Without plankton, fish died. Without fish, the marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs and the mosasaurs, died as well. The surface of the ocean, once a living mass in constant motion, became still and opaque, covered by a film of decomposing organisms. On land, the last non-avian dinosaurs faced a slow agony. Their bodies, too large, demanded quantities of food that no longer existed. Their eggs, dependent on stable temperatures, never hatched. Their young, exposed to a world without vegetation or prey, never reached maturity. It was not an extinction in an instant. It was a progressive disappearance marked by hunger, cold, and desperation, generation after generation. Their bones remain scattered across valleys covered in ash, the epitaph of an empire 180 million years old. Paleobotanical research carried out at sites such as Corral Bluffs, near Denver, Colorado, has reconstructed with remarkable precision the sequence of what happened in the biosphere during that period. The sedimentary record shows that immediately after the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, there was an explosion of fungal spores. Fungi thrive on decaying matter. The signal is unmistakable. Most of the living world was rotting. Then, above that fungal layer, fern spores appear. Ferns are pioneer plants, organisms with extraordinary resilience for colonizing devastated landscapes. They appear after forest fires, after volcanic eruptions, on the margins of deserts. Their appearance in the fossil record, a few thousand years after the impact, was the first sign that life was trying to regain ground. But the world was still a place of silence and ash. The heirs of the ruins. The survival of those who had not reached that moment by accident. Mammals had spent more than 100 million years perfecting a series of adaptations that, in the context of the late Cretaceous apocalypse, turned out to be exactly the right ones. Their small size made them less demanding in caloric terms. They could survive with less food for longer periods. Their diets were flexible: seeds, insects, fungi, carrion, roots. They did not depend on any specific type of prey or any particular plant. They were, in the vocabulary of ecology, generalists in the most radical sense. But that flexibility was not accidental. It was the result of more than 160 million years living on the margins of the Mesozoic world. Throughout the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, mammals had been relegated to nocturnal niches and to the narrowest spaces of the ecosystem by the overwhelming dominance of the dinosaurs. That imposed marginality was, paradoxically, their greatest school. They learned to eat whatever was available, to move when others slept, to reproduce quickly and raise their young under adverse conditions. When the world collapsed, those abilities became the most valuable on the planet. Their behavior also saved them. Burrowing was one of their most effective survival strategies. Underground, temperatures were more stable. Ash-laden winds and acid rain could not reach them. Mothers gave birth in the darkness of their dens, nursing their young with milk, an extraordinary biological advantage in a world where food resources for external offspring had practically disappeared. While reptiles depended on eggs, exposed to external conditions, mammalian young received nutrients directly from the maternal body, and later through milk. Under those circumstances, that difference was the difference between living and dying. Milk was not only food, it was also transferred immunity. Maternal antibodies that pass to the newborn through colostrum, the first milk produced after birth, provide the neonate with immunological protection that allows it to survive the first weeks of life in pathogen-rich environments. Exactly the kind of environment the post-impact world represented. The decomposing bodies of millions of animals, stagnant waters filled with rotting organic matter, soil saturated with opportunistic microorganisms. That entire epidemiological landscape would have been lethal for offspring without immunity. The mammalian lactation system functioned as a biological shield that no reptile could replicate. Insects, especially beetles and other scavengers, thrived amid the chaos. They fed on the dead organic matter that covered the planet in abundance. That explosion of insects provided a sustained food source for small, agile mammals capable of hunting them. While the food chain of large vertebrates collapsed, a parallel circuit of decomposition and opportunism existed that mammals knew how to exploit. Termites, particularly resistant to environmental disturbances thanks to their social organization and their ability to live completely sealed within their mounds, survived the extinction in large numbers. They were a concentrated protein resource, available in any piece of rotting wood, in any soil rich in organic matter. For a mammal with strong teeth and claws for digging, a termite colony was a guaranteed feast. Fungi, which appear in the pollen record of Corral Bluffs as an explosion immediately following the KPG boundary, played a role that researchers were slow to appreciate. By decomposing the massively accumulated organic matter, fungi transformed corpses, fallen trunks, and leaf litter into a nutrient-rich substrate. Mammals that could consume fungi directly, or that could eat the invertebrates that proliferated on them, had access to an enormous caloric source in a world where almost everything else had disappeared. Some modern mammal species have a known dependence on fungi in their diets, including certain squirrels that eat truffles and other underground fungi. It is plausible that this relationship has evolutionary roots that trace back precisely to the extinction period. Some amphibians survived thanks to their ability to hibernate and their tolerance to acidic waters. Turtles and crocodilians, slow in their metabolism and tolerant of environmental stress, endured in isolated refuges. Crocodilians in particular show remarkable continuity in the fossil record across the KPG boundary. Their strategy of long life, low metabolism, the ability to fast for months, and an opportunistic diet made them almost immune to the disturbances that eliminated more specialized animals. It is not for nothing that scientists sometimes call them living fossils. The basic body design of the crocodile has not fundamentally changed for 80 million years because, in evolutionary terms, it works under almost any condition. Birds, descendants of theropod dinosaurs, also began to diversify rapidly after the extinction, but their trajectory diverged significantly from that of mammals. The birds that survived the KPG boundary were mainly small, with high metabolisms and seed-eating or insectivorous diets. Adaptations that made them resilient to the same types of pressures that had favored mammals. In the first decades and centuries after the impact, birds and mammals competed for the same resources in the same microhabitats, the detritus of the destroyed world. That early competition shaped the direction of diversification of both groups. Where birds dominated the airspace, mammals found their opportunities on the ground and underground. Where mammals specialized in particular plants or terrestrial prey, birds avoided direct competition by moving up toward the canopy or exploiting aquatic environments. Weeks after the impact turned into months. The black of the sky shifted to gray. Windows of filtered light, weak and insufficient to sustain forests, began to appear. Ferns and mosses, plants that reproduce by spores capable of surviving in the soil for years, began to sprout. Green returned to the world, but in patches, in whispers, not in waves. Ferns are remarkably resilient plants. Their underground rhizome systems can survive complete fires and resprout in days. In Corral Bluffs, the pollen record shows that unmistakable signal, a layer of fern spores massively dominant in the sediment corresponding to the first thousands of years after the extinction. Paleobotanists call it the fern spike, and it appears in KPG boundary deposits all over the world, from Colorado to New Zealand. The same global signature of a planet attempting to regenerate with its most resilient tools. Mammals began to move cautiously away from their refuges. They explored the surface, tested unfamiliar plants, sniffed the ash-laden air. Their populations were small, their territories modest, but they were alive, and with each generation that passed, they learned something new about the world that had been handed to them. The speed of generations was crucial. A small mammal of the early Paleocene could complete a reproductive generation in just a few months. Compared with a large dinosaur that required years to reach sexual maturity, that generational speed allowed selective pressures to act with a much greater evolutionary pace. Under conditions of accelerated environmental change, having short generations is not a weakness. It is an extraordinary advantage, and each generation is a new opportunity for natural selection to adjust the design of the animal to the conditions of the moment. The mammals of the Paleocene were being sculpted by natural selection with an intensity and speed that no group of large vertebrates had experienced during the Mesozoic. Some began to group together for the first time in more complex ways. Small groups improved the chances of survival, more eyes to detect danger, more individuals to share the work of obtaining food and protecting the young. Others specialized in specific niches, longer limbs for climbing, webbed feet for the wetlands that were beginning to form as rains returned regularly. In almost invisible steps, the process of mammalian diversification had begun. The volcanic activity of the Deccan Traps in India, which had already been underway for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact and continued for hundreds of thousands of years afterward, kept injecting carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. In the short term, sulfur dioxide contributed to cooling and acid rain. In the long term, carbon dioxide acted as a greenhouse gas and began to warm the planet again. Temperatures started to rise gradually, rainfall intensified, rivers grew, vast wetlands began to form. These wetlands, rich in nutrients from soils, fertilized by the massive decomposition of millions of organisms, became cradles of biodiversity. On their margins grew the first flowering plants returning to the world. In their waters thrived the fish that had survived in underground rivers or protected springs. And on their shores, mammals found water, food, and the density of life that made ecological complexity possible. The world of the dinosaurs had ended. The world of mammals was just beginning to breathe. The Paleocene, the silent dawn, 66 to 56 million years before the present, 300,000 years. That was the time it took for a forest canopy to appear in the devastated regions of the planet after the impact. 300,000 years, a geological instant, for the pioneering ferns to be replaced by palms and then by larger trees. The Corral Bluffs record documents it with unusual clarity. First the fungi, then the ferns, then the palms, then diversity. Each layer of rock is a page in the Book of Recovery. And as the forest returned, mammals changed. The Paleocene, the first epoch of the Cenozoic, extended from 66 to 56 million years before the present. It was an era of discrete experimentation, of evolutionary trial and error in a world that was still processing the trauma of extinction. The mammals of this period were, in general, creatures of modest size, not very different in appearance from modern rats or rabbits. But their teeth told a different story. Teeth are the most durable testimony of mammals in the fossil record. They are the most mineralized structures in the body, the most resistant to degradation. And every shape, every cusp, every wear angle reveals what that animal ate. Early Paleocene mammals showed generalist dentitions, front teeth for tearing, flatter rear molars for grinding. They were omnivores out of necessity, capable of processing both animal protein and plant material. That flexibility was their first great advantage in the New World. Among the best documented forms of this period are the multituberculates, an extinct lineage of rodent-like mammals that flourished extraordinarily during the Paleocene. Their teeth, with multiple complex cusps, were designed to grind tough plant material. They lived in trees or burrows, in a manner similar to modern squirrels or rats, and their abundance in the fossil record suggests that they occupied dozens of different ecological niches. In many ways, they were the dominant mammals of the early Paleocene. The condylarths, A group of primitive ungulate mammals also emerged during this period. They were mostly herbivores or omnivores, with limbs adapted for walking across flooded or open forest terrains. Their experiments in dental structure and limb form pointed toward a future of great diversity. They would become the evolutionary precursors of deer, horses, and elephants. Although in the Paleocene they were still small and relatively unspecialized creatures wandering along river margins and palm prairies. The paleontological discovery at Corral Bluffs, documented by the team of paleontologist Tyler Lyson together with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, revealed something the scientific community had not expected to find with such clarity: the direct connection between the appearance of new plants and the increase in the body size of mammals. The volunteer Sharon Melito was the one who found the first mammal jaw during one of the excavations. Hidden inside a concretion, that type of rock that sometimes forms around organic material and preserves it with extraordinary fidelity for millions of years. The discovery triggered a systematic search that produced dozens of Paleocene mammal skulls, the largest and best-preserved collection from this period ever found. What those skulls revealed was a precise chronology of recovery. Mammals that lived about 300,000 years after the impact were small generalists. Those that lived 700,000 years after the impact were considerably larger, with flat teeth designed to process a variety of leaves and stems. The sedimentary record also showed that it was precisely around that time, 700,000 years after the extinction, when fossil legume pods appeared for the first time. The legume pod found by the student Aon Way Smith turned out to be the oldest ever recorded, pushing back the known fossil record of that plant family by 4 million years and placing its origin in North America. Legumes are highly nutritious plants, rich in protein. Their appearance was for Paleocene mammals what the great grasslands would later be for Miocene ungulates, a high-energy food resource that accelerated body growth and facilitated specialization. 700,000 years after the impact, without the presence of dinosaurs, some mammal species had reached sizes that had not existed in the previous 100 million years. That growth was not gradual or linear. It was explosive. Marsupials also began to diversify during the Paleocene, although still in a limited way. Their reproductive strategy, with short gestation periods and offspring that continued their development in pouches or protected nests, gave them an advantage in unstable environments. Mothers could continue foraging and avoiding predators while their young completed their development in the relative safety of the pouch. It was a different evolutionary response to the same challenge: how to produce viable offspring in a hostile world. Insectivores, ancestors of modern moles and shrews, also proliferated. Small and voracious, with sharp teeth designed to penetrate the exoskeleton of insects, they controlled the populations of arthropods that had flourished in the chaos of the extinction. They were essential pieces in the emerging Paleocene ecosystem, controlling insects that in turn processed decomposing organic matter. The Paleocene climate was warm and humid, with little seasonal variation. Tropical and subtropical forests expanded across vast areas of the planet, including regions that today lie at temperate or cold latitudes. These dense forests provided abundant food and shelter, ideal conditions for the rapid diversification of mammalian forms. Flowering plants, which had survived the extinction relatively successfully thanks to their ability to reproduce quickly, flourished and produced fruits and seeds that fed herbivores of all kinds. The wetlands of the Paleocene, nourished by increasingly regular rains, became centers of extraordinary biodiversity. Shallow lakes and marshes hosted amphibians, fish, reptiles, and the first semi-aquatic mammals. Some of these mammals began to develop webbed feet and dense, waterproof fur, adaptations that allowed them to exploit the resources of aquatic environments. Mollusks, small fish, freshwater invertebrates. Niches that had previously belonged to aquatic reptiles were now available, and mammals were conquering them for the first time from the shoreline. By the time the Paleocene gave way to the Eocene, 56 million years ago, mammals had ceased to be the accidental survivors of a catastrophe. They were the active architects of a new biological order. They were not yet dominant in the absolute sense of the term. They still shared the world with large flightless birds, with crocodiles, with giant turtles. But they had planted their roots in every type of available habitat. And they were growing. The Eocene, the Great Explosion, 56 to 34 million years before present. The world warmed. At the beginning of the Eocene, approximately 56 million years ago, an event known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum raised global temperatures by between 5 and 8 additional degrees Celsius over a period of about 20,000 years, a blink on the geological timescale. The most widely accepted hypotheses about its cause point to the massive release of carbon from volcanic eruptions in the North Atlantic, possibly amplified by the destabilization of methane hydrates on the ocean floor. Regardless of the precise mechanism, the result was the warmest period of the Cenozoic. Tropical forests in the polar regions, surface ocean temperatures above 20 degrees Celsius at high latitudes, and a biodiversity that flourished with unprecedented exuberance. For mammals, it was the moment of the Great Explosion. The Eocene, which extended from 56 to 34 million years before the present, is considered by paleontologists as the dawn of modern mammals. It was during this epoch that most of the major mammalian groups, recognizable today, made their first documented appearance in the fossil record. Ungulates developed hooves. Cetaceans began their return to the sea. Primates took their first clearly differentiated steps. Carnivores refined their teeth and their hunting strategies. In no other comparable period of time in the history of terrestrial vertebrates did an equivalent degree of mammalian morphological innovation occur. The Eocene was, in that sense, the boldest evolutionary experiment the Earth has witnessed since the Cambrian explosion. Perissodactyls, odd-toed ungulates among which are counted the ancestors of horses, rhinoceroses, and tapirs, experienced explosive diversification during the Eocene. The primitive horse of this period, known as Hyracotherium, was a creature barely 40 centimeters tall, with 4 toes on the front legs and 3 on the hind legs, adapted to move through the dense vegetation of tropical forests. Its teeth, with low crowns, were designed for eating soft leaves, not grass. It was difficult to see in it the equus that would gallop across the steppes tens of millions of years later, but the direction was already marked. What Hyracotherium represents is not the horse as we know it, but proof that natural selection was already working toward locomotor efficiency. In the open forests of the Eocene, being able to move more quickly among the trees had survival value. Brontotheres, gigantic perissodactyls that reached during the Eocene the size of a modern rhinoceros, but with more massive proportions and nasal bone structures that in some genera produced large, bifurcated protuberances, represent one of the most spectacular experiments of the Eocene. Genera, such as Megacerops, whose remains are abundant in the White River Formation of North America, weighed several thousand kilograms and grazed in the open forests of the region. Their massive bodies were an evolutionary response both to the food abundance of the warm Eocene and to the need to deter the creodont predators that shared their habitat. The extinction of the Brontotheres at the end of the Eocene, when the climate began to cool and forests started to retreat, is one of the most documented cases of how climate change can eliminate entire lineages of large mammals regardless of their previous success. Artiodactyls, even-toed ungulates, also proliferated. This group, which includes the ancestors of deer, pigs, camels, and whales, showed during the Eocene one of the most extraordinary evolutionary trajectories in the history of vertebrates. the transition from terrestrial mammals to fully aquatic mammals. Archaeocetes, the earliest known cetaceans, were animals that still retained functional limbs for walking on land, but spent increasingly more time in the shallow coastal waters of what is now South Asia. The genus Pachycetus, discovered in sediments from the early Eocene of northern Pakistan, was about the size of a medium wolf, with 4 functional limbs and a skull whose ears were already positioned in an anatomical configuration that showed adaptations for underwater hearing, although it still possessed the carnivorous dentition it would use to hunt fish from the shores of rivers and lakes. In Ambulocetus, only a few million years later, the hind legs were already larger and more webbed than the forelimbs, designed to propel the animal in the water while still capable of supporting its weight on land. In Rhodopsitus, the pelvic bones were no longer fused to the vertebral column, a clear sign that the body's weight was no longer supported primarily by the hind limbs. The sequence of Eocene genera of early cetaceans is one of the most complete evolutionary transition records known in vertebrate paleontology. Primates flourished in the Eocene with particular vitality. The tropical forests that covered vast areas of the planet offered the perfect habitat for arboreal animals with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes. The earliest Eocene primates, including genera such as Cantius in North America and Europe and Tailhardina in Asia, were small, agile creatures specialized for life among the trees. Their frontally positioned eyes provided stereoscopic vision essential for judging distances when leaping between branches. Their hands, with flexible fingers, allowed them to grasp both branches and fruits and insects with precision. These characteristics, which today we recognize as definitively primate, appeared in the Eocene as adaptive responses to a specific and complex forest environment. The debate over whether primates originated in Asia, North America, or Africa remains unresolved, but the early Eocene fossil record shows their simultaneous presence on the 3 northern continents, suggesting an early and rapid dispersal during the period of maximum global warming, when Arctic forest corridors connected North America with Europe and Europe with Asia. The discovery of Darwinius massilae, popularly known as Ida, in the deposits of the Messel Formation in Germany, with extraordinary preservation, including the outline of the fur and stomach contents, provided in 2009 a detailed view of a Middle Eocene primate from approximately 47 million years ago. An animal about 60 centimeters in total length, with nails instead of claws on all digits except one, and an eye-to-skull proportion suggesting both diurnal and crepuscular activity. Creodonts, a group of carnivorous mammals that is now extinct, dominated predator roles during much of the Eocene. With slicing teeth and muscular bodies, they hunted medium and large prey in a world where herbivore diversity was steadily increasing. They were not the same creodonts of the Paleocene, small and opportunistic. Those of the Eocene reached sizes comparable to modern large felines, and several lineages developed elongated canine teeth that foreshadowed those of the saber-toothed cats that would dominate later eras. The genus Hyaenodon, which persisted from the Eocene to the Miocene, reached in its largest forms more than 300 kilograms, with a disproportionately large head relative to its body and carnassial teeth of enormous cutting power. It was the functional equivalent of the large leopard of its time, a solitary ambush predator capable of killing prey of its own weight or larger. But while creodonts dominated the present, the carnivorans, the group that includes modern dogs, cats, bears, and mustelids, were beginning their quiet rise. Their more flexible hunting strategies, relatively larger brains, and more complex social behaviors gave them long-term advantages that creodonts could not match. The earliest Eocene carnivorans, such as the myocoids, were small animals resembling modern genets, living in trees and feeding mainly on small vertebrates and invertebrates. They were not the great predators of the Eocene, but generation by generation, they were building the set of cognitive and behavioral traits that would eventually allow them to displace creodonts from every large predator niche. Animals such as Chalicotherium, a perissodactyl with claws instead of hooves that supported itself on the knuckles of its forelimbs to reach the high leaves of trees, represent the experimental audacity of the Eocene. The convergence of Chalicotherium with modern gorillas and its knuckle-walking locomotion, despite having no close relationship with primates, is one of the most frequently cited examples of convergent evolution in mammals. Independent evolutionary solutions to the same functional problem, moving a heavy body while using the hands to reach elevated food. Pantodonts, such as the massive Coryphodon, reached sizes in the Eocene comparable to those of a modern hippopotamus. Coryphodon is particularly notable because its remains appear in late Paleocene and early Eocene sediments of North America, Europe, and Asia, making it one of the earliest large mammals with a widely documented intercontinental geographic distribution. The climate of the Eocene was not uniform throughout its 22 million years of duration. After the thermal peak of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, temperatures declined irregularly but steadily. By the Middle Eocene, between 45 and 40 million years ago, the planet was still noticeably warmer than today, but cooling had already become a clearly established trend. The great Eocene lakes, such as the Green River Lake system in what are now the states of Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado, produced extraordinarily rich lacustrine fossil deposits. The fish of the Green River Lake, whose scales still shine after 50 million years. In the Fayum Formation of the Egyptian desert, late Eocene and early Oligocene deposits preserve the African fauna of that period, including the first proboscideans and the ancestors of African apes. In the marine sediments of the Eocene of Pakistan and India are found the most complete sequence of transitional land-to-sea cetaceans. Each of these deposits is a different chapter of the same book. The story of how mammals took possession of a world that had been handed to them empty and filled it, in 20 million years, with a diversity that has no parallel in the previous history of terrestrial vertebrates. Toward the end of the Eocene, however, the climate began to change with greater urgency. Temperatures started to fall. Antarctic glaciers, which had remained melted during the Eocene, began to accumulate. Sea levels dropped. Tropical forests began to retreat toward the equator. Animals more specialized for life in dense, warm jungles without a dry season began to lose their habitat. The extinction event at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, known as the Grande Coupure in Europe, was significant. Several lineages of European mammals that had flourished during the Eocene disappeared, replaced by forms arriving from Asia through land bridges that the fallen sea level had reopened. It was the first sign that mammals were not exempt from the relentless logic of climate change that had dominated the history of life long before they existed. What came next would once again test their resilience, under conditions the planet had not experienced since the early Oligocene. The Oligocene, the test of cold, 34 to 23 million years before present. The world shrank. At the beginning of the Oligocene, 34 million years ago, Earth experienced one of the fastest cooling events in its recent history. Antarctica became covered in ice for the first time in millions of years. Ocean currents changed as the southern continent separated from South America and Australia, allowing an Antarctic circumpolar current to establish itself and thermally isolate the South Pole. The result was a global reduction in temperatures that transformed ecosystems from one end of the planet to the other. Tropical forests retreated. Temperate forests began to thin out. In their place, more open landscapes expanded. Wooded savannas, herbaceous grasslands, and dry shrublands. For many of the groups that had flourished in the lushness of the Eocene, it was a devastating blow. The multituberculates, which had dominated the niches of small herbivorous mammals for almost 50 million years, disappeared during the Oligocene, unable to compete with the more efficient rodents that had been progressively replacing them. It was the end of one of the longest-lived mammalian lineages in history. Paraceratherium, sometimes called Indricotherium, was the largest terrestrial mammal known. Estimates based on its fossil remains suggest a body mass of between 15 and 20 metric tons, with a shoulder height of approximately 5 meters. It was a long-necked animal, similar to a giraffe in its functional design, capable of reaching the vegetation of the trees that still bordered the open landscapes of Oligocene Central Asia. It had no horn. Its defensive strategy was simply its size. The creodonts began their definitive decline during the Oligocene, increasingly pressured by the expansion and sophistication of carnivorans. The group Carnivora developed during this period a diversity of forms that began to foreshadow the one we know today. On the southern continents, the history of the Oligocene unfolded differently. South America, isolated from the rest of the world since the fragmentation of Gondwana, had developed a completely native mammalian fauna. The Litopterns, which converged anatomically with horses without being close relatives. The Notungulates, herbivores of extremely diverse forms that filled the niches of rhinoceroses and tapirs without actually being them. The Macrauchinids, with long necks and flexible noses. And the terrifying Phorusrhacids, flightless birds more than 2 meters tall with curved beaks, capable of killing medium-sized mammals, which occupied the role of large predators that, in other continents, corresponded to mammalian carnivores. The result is an evolutionary arms race in which both predators and herbivores compete to be faster, more resilient, capable of greater sustained speed. The long legs of modern ungulates, their hardened hooves, their large-capacity lungs, their ability to gallop for hours, are all responses to the Miocene. The equids of the Miocene show this transformation clearly. Merychippus, which lived between 15 and 12 million years ago in North America, was already a larger animal than its Eocene predecessors, with a single functional hoof per leg, although still retaining vestiges of lateral toes and high-crowned teeth perfectly adapted for grazing in open grasslands. It was the first genuinely grassland horse, the prototype of what the genus Equus would eventually represent. Simiopithecus and Dryopithecus, names given by paleontologists to different Miocene genera of great apes, show characteristics that link them with modern great apes: relatively large brains, absence of tail, and long upper limbs adapted for suspension from branches. Some species already exhibit forms of complex social behavior, and even indications of the use of objects as rudimentary tools. The record of marine mammals in the Miocene is equally remarkable. Cetaceans developed during this period their echolocation abilities with a sophistication that had no precedent. The odontocetes, the toothed cetaceans that include dolphins and sperm whales, perfected the biological sonar system that allowed them to hunt in deep and dark waters, detecting prey at distances of dozens of meters through the analysis of the echoes of their own clicks and whistles. The Mysticetes, the baleen whales, developed the filtration system that allowed them to consume krill and small fish in massive quantities, with some species reaching sizes that exceeded those of any animal that had previously existed in the history of the planet. The Miocene was also the period in which tectonics began to redesign the maps in a way that would have profound consequences for mammalian fauna. The uplift of the Himalayas, in continuous process since the collision of the Indian subcontinent with Asia, was already modifying the climatic patterns of the entire temperate northern area, creating the rain shadow that would push the interior territories of Central Asia toward aridity. In Africa, the Great Rift Valley was beginning to open, fracturing the continent's tropical forest into fragments separated by more open areas. that fragmentation of the African forest, which would intensify in the Pliocene, is considered by many researchers to be one of the environmental factors that would push hominids toward bipedal locomotion. The first indications of hominins, the lineage that leads to modern humans, appear at the end of the Miocene. Sahelanthropus chadensis, whose remains were discovered in Chad and date from between 7 and 6 million years ago, already shows characteristics of the skull that specialists associate with bipedal locomotion, although its precise classification in the human evolutionary tree continues to be the subject of scientific debate. The great stage of the Miocene, with its expanding savannas and retreating forests, was producing the selective pressures that would shape the human lineage in the millions of years that followed. The Pliocene, the glacial prelude, 5.3 to 2.6 million years before present. The cold was advancing from the poles. The Pliocene, which lasted from about 5.3 million to 2.6 million years ago, was a period of climatic transition in which the planet continued to cool steadily. The polar ice caps grew. Seasonal variations became more pronounced. The interior regions of the continents became more arid. Forests continued to retreat toward the equatorial zones and the coasts, and savannas and steppes continued advancing into the middle latitudes. For many groups of mammals, the Pliocene was a period of final refinement before the great test of the glaciations that would come. The equids of the Pliocene showed a diversity of simultaneous genera, such as might never again be seen in the history of the group. Several species of the genus Pliohippus and the genus Dinohippus coexisted in North America with different adaptations for different habitats. Some adapted to arid grasslands, others to more humid prairies, and others to wooded areas along river margins. This explosion of diversity in Pliocene horses contrasts with the impoverishment that would come later, when human expansion and the glaciations reduced the group to the few species that survive today. The camelids of the Pliocene also experienced a phase of notable diversification. The North American forms, where the group had evolved, began to migrate to other parts of the world through the available land bridges. Toward the south, through the Isthmus of Panama, which closed definitively about 3 million years ago, camelids reached South America and gave rise to llamas, alpacas, guanacos, and vicuñas. Toward the west, through the Beringia land bridge, they reached Asia and Africa, where they became the dromedary and Bactrian camels we recognize today. The closing of the Isthmus of Panama was not only an escape route for camelids, it was one of the most important biogeographical events of the Pliocene. The Pleistocene, the age of giants and ice, 2.6 million to 11,700 years before present. The ice advanced. 2.6 million years ago, the Milankovitch cycles, the variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, began to produce glaciations of an intensity the planet had not experienced for tens of millions of years. Ice sheets expanded from the poles toward the mid-latitudes, covering vast expanses of what are now North America, Europe, and northern Asia, beneath ice layers kilometers thick. Sea level fell by dozens of meters, exposing continental shelves that connected territories now separated by oceans. Beringia, linking Siberia with Alaska, the British Isles with the European continent, Sundaland, the land bridge of Southeast Asia, and in that world of ice and steppe, the mammals grew. The megafauna of the Pleistocene, the animals that researchers group under that imprecise yet evocative term, represented the pinnacle of the mammalian experiment in terms of body size. The woolly mammoths, Mammuthus primigenius, covered in dense brown hair, with tusks up to 3.5 meters long curved upward and inward, inhabited the cold steppes of the northern hemisphere in large herds, browsing grasses and shrubs under conditions we would recognize today as similar to those of the Arctic tundra. Their bodies, adapted to conserve body heat, followed the same principle that governs the form of modern Arctic mammals: large, compact, with limbs short in proportion to the torso, minimizing the relative surface through which heat is lost. Smilodon, the most famous of the saber-toothed cats, thrived during the Pleistocene in North and South America. With canines up to 28 centimeters long in the species Smilodon populator, the largest of the 3 known species, it was a predator designed to kill large prey with deep bites to vital regions. The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, California, have preserved the remains of thousands of individuals of Smilodon fatalis, along with the herbivores it hunted and other scavengers, in an exceptionally rich fossil record that allows the ecological interactions of Pleistocene California to be reconstructed with unusual detail. Dire wolves, Anocyon dirus, formed packs that hunted bison, horses, and other large ungulates on the Pleistocene plains. They were animals of greater body mass than modern gray wolves, with more robust teeth adapted for consuming bone. Modern humans, who are not of sub-Saharan African ancestry, carry between 1.8 and 2.6% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Homo sapiens, our species, appeared in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. It left Africa in at least 2 major migratory waves, the last and most successful of which occurred between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago. By 45,000 years ago, it had already reached Australia. By 15,000 years ago, it had crossed Bering into the Americas. In Eurasia, woolly mammoths continued to survive in island refuges, the latest on Wrangel Island in the Siberian Arctic, until about 4,000 years before present. The scientific debate over the causes of this mass extinction has lasted for decades and is still not completely resolved. The 2 main hypotheses are not mutually exclusive: climate change at the end of the last glaciation and human hunting pressure. The end of the last glacial maximum, about 19,000 years ago, was followed by a relatively rapid warming that transformed the cold steppes into boreal forests and Arctic tundra. The habitat of the mammoth steppe, that cold and productive grassland that had fed herbivorous megafauna for tens of thousands of years, shrank dramatically. Populations of large herbivores declined, and with them, the large carnivores that depended on them. But the temporal pattern of the extinctions shows a correlation too precise with human arrivals to be ignored. In Australia, the extinction preceded the end of the glaciations by more than 30,000 years. On the islands of the Mediterranean, where dwarfed forms of continental species had evolved for millions of years in the absence of mammalian predators, extinction followed human colonization with a punctuality that researchers have documented island by island. In Madagascar, giant lemurs and elephant birds, Epiornis maximus, survived until barely 2,000 years ago, when human colonization of the island continent swept them away. The conclusion most consistent with the totality of the available data is that the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna was the result of a combination of factors: a climate change that reduced and fragmented habitats, combined with hunting pressure from a new species, intelligent, technologically equipped, and socially coordinated, that had never before existed on the planet. Neither the megafauna nor the ecosystems had had evolutionary time to develop behavioral or demographic responses to this unprecedented threat. The ecological consequences of the extinction of the megafauna were profound. Large herbivores had been engineers of their ecosystems. They grazed, trampled, knocked down trees, and transported seeds in their intestines over great distances. Their disappearance altered fire regimes, vegetation composition, and nutrient cycles. Some researchers have proposed that the restoration of large herbivores in the Siberian steppes could help stabilize Arctic permafrost by compacting the snow and reducing the thermal insulation of the ground. slowing the release of methane trapped within it. The proposal, known as Pleistocene Park, has been implemented on a small scale in the Sakha Republic of Russia by the ecologist Sergei Zimov since the 1990s. The ecosystems that remained after the extinction of the megafauna were impoverished shadows of what they had once been. The continents that had once hosted dozens of genera of large herbivores and carnivores were left with only a few. Africa, where megafauna evolved in the presence of hominins for millions of years and had time to develop a certain degree of wariness toward humans, preserved the greatest residual diversity of large mammals. That is why Africa is today the continent of elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, lions, and giraffes. Not because there is something intrinsically African about that diversity, but because there the megafauna had more time to adapt to the human presence. The triumph and the burden of being a mammal, adaptations, heritage, and the future. Mammals have dominated the Earth for 66 million years. The dominance was not the result of brute strength, nor of simple luck. It was the product of a series of evolutionary innovations accumulated over tens of millions of years prior to the Cretaceous, which turned out to be exactly the right tools for the world the asteroid left behind. To understand those innovations is to understand why we are what we are. Endothermy, the ability to generate one's own metabolic heat, was perhaps the most decisive. Mammals maintain a constant body temperature regardless of the temperature of the environment. This property, shared with birds, although achieved through different evolutionary routes, requires a much higher metabolism than that of ectotherms. A mammal needs approximately 10 times more calories than a reptile of comparable size in order to maintain its temperature. But in return, it can remain active at any environmental temperature. It can move in the darkness of winter. It can survive in conditions that would immobilize a reptile. In the world after the impact, where temperatures plummeted and darkness lasted for years, that capacity was a matter of life or death. Hair, which had begun to evolve in Permian synapsids long before the first true mammals existed, provided the essential layer of thermal insulation that makes endothermy possible without a prohibitive caloric cost. Vibrissae, the specialized sensory hairs that most mammals carry on their snouts, are an inheritance from those same Permian synapsids, a sensory system that allowed them to detect their surroundings in the darkness of burrows and during the night. The placenta and lactation redefined the relationship between mother and offspring. Placental mammals, the group that includes the vast majority of living species, carry their young during gestation periods ranging from a few weeks in mice to 22 months in elephants, during which the maternal organism actively nourishes the fetus through the placenta. Afterwards, lactation extends that parental investment for additional months or years. The result is that mammalian young are born with greater neurological development, learn more, and have greater chances of survival than the young of any other comparable group of vertebrates. The heterodont teeth of mammals, inherited from Triassic cynodonts, are one of the most versatile evolutionary innovations in vertebrate history. Unlike reptiles, which have uniform teeth that are replaced throughout their lives, mammals possess incisors for cutting, canines for tearing, premolars and molars for grinding, and in many groups, additional specializations that have no equivalent in any other vertebrate. This dental diversity is directly responsible for the dietary diversity of mammals. The same basic anatomical principles are modified to produce the teeth of an elephant, the tusks of a narwhal, the baleen of a whale, and the prismatic enamel of a rat. The mammalian brain, especially the neocortex, the superficial layer of the cerebral cortex responsible for most higher cognitive processing, is the component that distinguishes mammals most clearly from all other vertebrates. Mammals not only have large brains in absolute terms, they have large brains relative to their body mass, especially in the more derived groups such as primates, cetaceans, and carnivorans. They transformed 61% of the Earth's land surface into agricultural, urban, or heavily modified landscapes. They introduced invasive species to every island and continent. They release into the atmosphere carbon that had been stored for millions of years in fossil fuel deposits, initiating a process of anthropogenic climate change that is altering ecosystems at a speed comparable to that of the great changes of the Cenozoic. And in doing so, they are producing what some researchers call the sixth mass extinction, a loss of biodiversity, whose rate exceeds that of any comparable period, with the exception of the 5 great extinction events in the geological record. The most conservative estimates indicate that the current extinction rate is at least 100 times higher than the pre-industrial background rate. The most alarming estimates place it at 1,000 times higher. Not all mammals are in decline. Species that have adapted to human environments, rats, pigeons, urban foxes, suburban deer, some cetaceans that exploit fishing grounds as a source of food, are proliferating. The world humans have built favors highly reproductive generalists with low habitat specialization, exactly as the world the asteroid created 66 million years ago favored the first Paleocene mammals. The history of mammals is, in the end, a story about what life does when the world changes. When the asteroid erased the established order, mammals did not disappear because they were the strongest, or because they were the most perfectly adapted to the previous world. They survived because they were flexible, because they had brains that learned, teeth that adapted, diets that changed, behaviors that evolved, because they could raise their young under adverse conditions and pass on not only genes, but knowledge. That same flexibility, that same biological and behavioral plasticity, is today both the cause of the problems mammals face in the Anthropocene and the only plausible reason to hope that some of them will survive. The Age of Mammals began with an extinction. Perhaps it will not end with another.